children, I'll tell you the news. Don't worry about the names or dates, you already know it's true. Your doctor hates your baby, the prime minister's a ghost, and all them folks are sailing here 'cause they're in love with boats. Superfoods can save us from all our evil sin. JFK and Elvis own a bar in Wisconsin. And vaccinations were created by the CIA to steal votes from Bernie Sanders and turn your babies gay. So click the link you think you'd like and get tooled for a fight against those lefty fascist communists who are leaning too far right.
Hi and welcome to Not Another Fake Newscast. I'm Paul.
And I'm Jerry, and we're very lucky to be here today with Professor David Carroll. David is a teacher of design, media. He's Associate Professor of Media Design, actually, at the Parsons School of Design in New York. Personally, we came across you, David, via Twitter, I suppose, when you decided to take Cambridge Analytica to task through the courts in the UK in order to try and obtain your data from them. And I guess most of our listeners will be familiar with you as you were featured in the Great Hack documentary on Netflix. So, thanks for coming on to talk to us today.
It's great to be able to chat and to connect in these remote times.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess the first question I would have for you is about, your your background. What was it that got you into the profession, the teaching profession in particular, in media design and stuff like that? How did you end up in working in that field?
Sure. I think it's a lot about just being born at the right time in the right place, in the sense that grew up with understanding computers and technology and the communication system as always revolutionary, and growing up with that, and then graduating from university at the sort of peak of the .com boom, where if you knew what HTML spelled like, you could get a six-figure income. So this was the first sort of phase of technology euphoria. And so you sort of, that's what everybody did. You graduated from school and you got a job in the internet. And then, of course, it exploded just before September 11th. And then we sort of lived through the boom-bust period. And so you had to reconsider, refigure your career.
Yeah.
And then sort of towards 2010, I really focused on my academic career. And then in the mid-2010s, I got really restless in my academic career. So then I tried to become an entrepreneur and tried to start a tech company commercializing my research with grad students. And it was really during that time, sort of 2013, 14, 15, where I, as a function of trying to do a startup, had really embedded myself even more deeply in the industry than I had before.
Yeah.
And really understood how the sausage was made in terms of collecting data, monetizing it, and how the default settings were so incredibly invasive. And when you were sort of on the other side of the screen and you were trying to get people to use your products and you were able to track it, their every move, and once they connected their Facebook account, you were attaching their behavior to their identity. There were just these really uncomfortable moments of realizing how it all worked. And so, like most startups, mine failed. And so I was sort of in a moment of trying to whistleblow the sort of practices in the industry, that the industry was sort of inherently reckless with personal data, and it was built upon a big lie. And I was just trying to bring awareness to these things. So while the election of 2016 was going on, I had a natural curiosity to study how different companies were being employed by campaigns and what new technologies were being used by campaigns, and the sort of arms race of digital technology in American politics. And so in that way, Cambridge Analytica became, on my radar very early on. Just it was the thing to look at if you were interested in these topics. And when it came time to perform a legal response after the election, I was sort of recruited and targeted myself by Paul-Olivier Dehaye, who was the Swiss mathematician, researcher, who had really pioneered using European data protection law to do subject access requests, to compel companies to disclose personal data. And so he was looking for an American to do the request because he knew that if an American citizen did it, that it would prove several important strands of problematic things. So that was sort of how I was in the right place at the right time. I was familiar enough with the industry to know how it works, but also had kind of soured on it. So I was in no position to defend it. I was actually in a position to help expose it.
So what was it in particular that led him to approach you? Had you been putting feelers out, or was it something about your online presence? Had you spoken about the subject? What was it exactly that drew him to approaching you to carry out the request?
Yeah, I think it was online chatter, expressing strident views about personal data and privacy that were atypical for an American at the time.
Yeah.
So I think I stuck out that way. And I was concerned, especially if you may recall, in around 2014, 2015, there was a big kind of moral panic about ad blocking and installing ad blockers. And I was, at that point, trying to express to the industry that people were installing ad blockers, not just because the ads were annoying, but also because they had some underlying privacy anxieties. Mm-hmm. And the industry didn't want to hear that. But I think that also contributed. So I was out there saying, people install ad blockers because they have privacy anxiety. It's bubbling below the surface. So that's why I was an appealing candidate to someone like Paul, who just needed to find an American willing to do this. All it took was one American to do it, who was a registered voter, and then the records would line up, and then it would all start to become clear.
So, I mean, when you embarked upon that, did you understand how much of a public figure maybe you were going to become? Did you expect the sort of press attention? Did you expect them to be eventually making a documentary about that situation?
No, it would seem very bureaucratic and nerdy at the time. I was nervous because he had educated me about who SCL really were, and I had been in touch with Carroll at that time too, and so it was a little nerve-wracking, being fearful of finding out what we suspected.
Did you ever have any doubts about going through it?
Yeah.
Very much so. Still do.
Yeah. Because it was a risky endeavor. It did cost a lot of money. That even though I was, can claim some victories in battles, I did lose the war at the end of the day. Yeah. And so I was liable for adverse costs that were very, an amount of money I could never afford. So there was always that risk. We were very confident going into it that we would prevail, but we did not anticipate how the story would unfold. And so, so it was an expensive thing to do. And I think the risk of it is probably why it garnered the attention that it did, because on the surface it was a very bureaucratic, simple thing to do, but it ended up being risky in ways that shouldn't be risky. It shouldn't be risky to do this. Yeah,
I mean, very much a thing that we certainly even experience when we've spoken about things is the getting past the. For us, it was a very nerdy thing, like the issue with data, or getting to grips with it, and then trying to put that in a way first that people understand what it actually means for the data. And then on top of that, trying to keep it as an interesting thing. And as it turns out, people are paranoid about their data and they're getting more and more aware of it, which is probably why you ended up a bit of a poster child for this scenario, because you were just not to take anything away, but like the voice in the dark of the people who were actually concerned about it. And like you said, right place at the right time and grew up at the right time to be in the right situation. Like it's a mad subject when you approach it with people.
Yeah, and I think something like the Great Hack was a great tool for kind of explaining to maybe the layperson or somebody who isn't a big techie or particularly has a grasp on how this stuff works. The visualizations and the way it was packaged, I think, made it a lot more accessible. Someone like my wife, for example, like I was able to sit her down and go, look, this is the stuff that I've been banging on about for the past couple of years, watch this with me, and it'll maybe give you a bit more of an insight, and it certainly did. So I think, it's been positive in that respect. But, now I think obviously, as you kind of mentioned, David, it's important to keep the conversation going. In terms of the legal battle then, would you like to sort of explain to our listeners what the end point of that was?
Sure. So we took a two-pronged approach. So the first approach was to file with the Information Commissioner's Office, just file a regular complaint.
Yeah.
And there's no risk to doing that. And, anybody in the UK can do that if they feel that, they've done a subject access request and they detect some improper behavior or potential data abuse. So we filed that on July 4th, 2017, a symbolic day. As an American, sort of asking the ICO, like, why is a British military contractor in particular interfering in my democracy? What's going on? I thought we won our independence a long time ago. So obviously, it was a very technical document that went over the implications of the breach of the Data Protection Act. And of course, because I had a solicitor prepare that for me, Ravi Nayak, it was very rigorous and thorough. Then separately from that, we put together a legal claim because the data that they provided was not complete. It was not adequate. So what's interesting about the UK law is companies and organizations don't just have to disclose the data, but you have rights to challenge it and to ensure that it's as complete as legally required.
Yeah.
And part of the case was, here's some forensic evidence that we can show that this couldn't possibly be a complete data set. There has to be more. And there's also explanatory stuff that the company didn't provide that's also required. So
right.
From that perspective, it was going to be a slam dunk data protection legal claim, especially because the Information Commissioner's Office recognized the complaint, recognized the standing as an American citizen. So they even went before the House of Commons committee investigating and even explicitly said, it doesn't matter that he's an American citizen. His data was processed in the UK. In fact, it was probably processed on a server sitting in Edinburgh.
All right.
And that gives us the normal rights that any UK citizen would have. It's actually not relevant to citizenship. It's only relevant to whether or not you can prove your data was processed on that territory or in that territory. So we were headed for success and victory because the case was really rock solid. And the only thing that they could complain about was the jurisdiction issue. But the regulator and the parliament was on my side. So I was going into it very strong. And what was remarkable is if we had prevailed, we would have shown that the company fundamentally committed data abuse in the US elections in 2016. And it wasn't just me. It was a violation of the rights of all registered voters in the United States. So it was well over 200 million instances of data abuse, and each instance carries a fine of £10,000. So like the theoretical fine was an eye-watering figure near the trillions of dollars. And so it was no wonder that the company hastily went out of business. So sort of shortly after, in the spring of 2018, when Carroll Cadwalader published the findings of Chris Wiley, the whistleblower, and at that time Brittany Kaiser cast herself as a whistleblower as well. It all came out in this whirlwind.
Interesting word, and we'll come back to that.
Yeah. And it all came out in a whirlwind, and the company used the negative press as a reason to close down and close shop in the UK and the US. And in doing so, it evaded its basic liabilities. So the beauty of the bankruptcy insolvency law is you are relieved of much of your liabilities. And so there was no way to further sue them.
Yeah, or pursue them.
So it was a real escape valve. The lucky thing is, though, because we had a two-pronged approach, we've both filed through the ICO and took a claim to the High Court. It enabled the ICO to prosecute them for the criminal offense of ignoring the order to disclose my data. So they did break a law by ignoring the authorities, and they decided that it would be better for them to pay that fine and admit that criminal offense than just disclose the data. So we did manage to achieve a sliver of justice as available by the system, and that was because of involving the regulator the way we did. We also succeeded in some other important things that once the legal case went into the next phase, which is where it got really risky, it moved from a human rights case to a insolvency case, where we tried to challenge in insolvency court the legitimacy of the administration, the legitimacy of the unwinding, the liquidation.
Yeah.
And we had some successes in that case where we got disclosures under a court order. And in those disclosures, we saw that the ICO was having a lot of difficulty getting the company to comply with the law, and it never did. And that was going on many months before the Guardian and New Yorker and Channel 4 stories emerged. So the company knew it had tremendous liability many, many months before this all exploded. What we also helped determine is that the company was having, the ICO, was having trouble getting passwords for certain servers through the administrators. There were 4 servers that the ICO could not get into. And in certain ways, our insolvency lawsuit helped pressure the administrator to hand over those passwords to the ICO. So the private action of a citizen did play a role in helping the regulator run a more effective investigation. However, the judge ruled against me in the end. The thing that we were asking for in insolvency court was for the administrators to be assigned to the Secretary of State and then another administrator to take over. And that they would have opened up the books to the public. They would have addressed the underlying mass data abuse. But the judge did not find that remedy was commensurate with the bias and problems with the corrupt insolvency and liquidation. So we sort of, that was the end of the road. And then I was liable for costs. The other outstanding tragedy is that the ICO has still not released the final report of what was on the servers that they seized under criminal warrant and conducted a multi-year forensic investigation of. So I'm quite concerned that we are, rocketing towards the next US election, and the UK authorities have still not shared with the public what happened in 2016. And I assume there's quite a bit of political pressure on the ICO to not release that report. I mean, that's the only explanation. They're now many months overdue.
Yeah. I mean, they are in many ways viewed here as a bit of a toothless organisation at times, although obviously you did manage to get some victories by going down that route. So there's a few things I want to go over then there in what you've said. The first one of interest is that it's the first time I've kind of heard that sort of suggested that the press sort of pressure that was put on Cambridge Analytica via The Guardian, particularly, I think, the sort of run up to them closing down was the Channel 4 undercover investigation, which sort of showed Alexander Nix, suggesting that they could, send girls to politicians' rooms and all that kind of stuff, So it's the first time I've heard it suggested that that was actually maybe convenient for them. So do you believe that to be the case?
I believe that to be the case from my perspective on how it unfolded, and then getting documents under court order and being able to trace the timeline back before what. So, if you think about, I have letters from the ICO to Alex Taylor, who's the chief data officer, dating back to the fall of 2017, where they were saying, no, the Data Protection Act really does apply to Americans. Yes, you really have to answer all these questions. Yes, you really have to disclose these things. Yes, you do. And the ICO has this reputation of being kind of toothless, because it's even worse in the US with the Federal Trade Commission, which is our privacy regulator, that they have to take such a light touch, and they have to give companies such the benefit of the doubt. They have to give them so much room to do the right thing before they drop the hammer, that it revealed that, for like 7 to 9 months, the ICO was letting SCL do the right thing before the story went public. And so they knew they were under the gun. And so, yes, it's true that client work fleed, but it's also a farce, because the client work is all coming from the same set of far-right donors who in turn own the company. So they could float the company if it was not profitable, if they wanted to. They just, so it's like, it's easy to say it's a failing business concern if you avoid the reality of how it actually runs as a business. That is, it's just a vehicle for a donor class.
Yeah, and the donors were not going to care about any of the stuff that was coming out in the press, as long as they were able to provide the data, the tools that they needed to win elections. Then they would have been happy.
That's right. But also they're excellent at using business law to their advantage, and it was sort of naive of us to pretend in the beginning that they wouldn't just use bankruptcy and insolvency to get out of trouble. That was our big miscalculation, is that, these guys just use shell companies and business customs and laws and transnational organizations to do their dirty work. Why wouldn't they just do it here? And that's exactly what they did.
Well, as soon as they folded, or not long after, actually just before they folded, and then subsequently after that, other companies that are in a very similar industry with very similar guidelines and route to market also have board members who are all family members or business partners of these people. Obviously, I can't prove 100% that they're directly involved in the same businesses, but they all operate with the same client base as well. So it's an easy way.
Nix, the Mercers.
Nix, Rebecca.
Was Wheatland on the board of Emerdata as well? But like more or less straight after Cambridge Analytica, or just before, you had the same board of directors in a different limited company?
Sure. So Emerdata Limited came to our attention by Wendy Siegelman, independent researcher who's quite good with going through business records and making sense of it. And we came across Emerdata in the legal case in the High Court, because Emerdata was the holding company that was funding the liquidation. So, and this is like customary. As absurd as it sounds, like all these subsidiaries were being folded into, acquired by, liquidated into the holding company. The holding company's sort of only purpose, ostensibly, was to just hold these various companies and transfer their assets as they go from one state to the other. So,
yeah,
but before the controversy exploded, Emerdata was going to be their sort of when in the film, when Julian Wheatland says we were on path to becoming $1 billion company, he's referring to Emerdata in that sentence, that Emerdata was going to be their sort of big power, big data play, that they really did see themselves as, they used the political election work as a sales tool to then win government contracts and commercial work. So basically they we can get presidents and prime ministers elected. We can also do your information operations and your military side, but we can also sell you soaps and ski vacations. And, they saw the money in the government work and the commercial work. The political work was just a lead generation tool.
Yeah. So, it was like, look what we've done here. We can do this for you. So, and I'm right in saying that one of Eric Prince's business partners was on the board there as well.
Yes, he's Hong Kong business partner.
Johnson Cole.
Yes.
There's it's really alarming over these years for those of us who have been paying attention to see how just a small group of associates have been working in parallel together on similar projects. So the way that Eric Prince keeps popping up, the way that Peter Thiel keeps popping up, the way that the Far Right International has used technology and business different ways to their advantage is, that's really been the larger theme of these past few years of uncovering this and then having to grapple with that. It's, these guys have already infiltrated many governments. What now?
Well, the Mercers crop up all the time. Steve Bannon crops up all the time, and the Mercers actually crop up in a dangerous way because they have, if you look at the back catalogue of the things that they've been involved in the past, they have lots of connections to the military, to design, to all the money that's gone through New York in terms of hedge funds and stuff. They're up there doing all of those things and have many, many powerful connections. It's
Sorry to interrupt. So I mean, that's kind of where you got up to with Cambridge Analytica, and there is no means to pursue them anymore, unfortunately. As a private citizen, it's a very costly process. It's obviously not something which is available for everybody either. So in many ways, it's a loaded dice that we're playing with if we want to try and take these companies to task. As you've stated, we have a toothless organisation in America, a toothless organisation in the UK, who aren't really capable of holding to task either. We have basically a system not really fit for purpose. So moving forward, what can we do to try and change this kind of infrastructure, this ecosystem?
So I had been very optimistic after the release of the film and the general response from audiences around the world, but even in the United States, that there was a real sort of positive movement towards reform is necessary. Now we understand the whole issues differently. I mean, what you were saying before about how the film provides access to complicated ideas that were difficult to communicate before. Definitely have had that experience where whenever I had gone to do panels after a screening or to do talks about the film, the sophistication of the questions that people have for me after show that the film has taken their knowledge to the next level. That before the film, you could never get these kind of sophisticated questions because it was so difficult just to get them to understand, let alone care. So the film as an educational tool is sort of unrivaled in that way. So it had really had a positive effect, and things were changing in the US with regards to getting lawmakers to take this seriously. The attitudes in the business world, in the marketing world, like you even had marketing people saying like, oh, maybe we're bad, maybe we're the baddies, and that was finally happening. And I was very optimistic and, doing podcasts and talks and going around and talking to lawmakers, and there's just a lot of momentum.
Yeah.
But I think the pandemic has radically change that dynamic. Obviously, it's unavoidable that it would not, but it has dramatically shifted our perspective around surveillance and privacy rights and data rights and the role of government and corporations in an instant. And so what I'm trying to deal with now is, how to participate in the debates that are happening around what is appropriate surveillance to confront the pandemic, and what are the things that will allow to happen during this time that we must undo when it's over.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that we discussed in our last episode was obviously Zoom at the present moment is in the middle of a bit of a legal dispute regarding the utilisation of people's data and maybe facilitating it to other people like Facebook, for example, even if they don't have Facebook accounts. That on top of knowing that Google and Apple are working together to, create some mass database to track the coronavirus. All of these things are, for someone who's been looking at this for so long, all these things are not saying that we shouldn't give away our liberties, by the way, but there is liberties being given because of this virus that I think charlatans may possibly utilise for personal gain at the other side of this.
Well, yeah, and we've already seen new rights given to the government in the UK in terms of what they can and can't do. As you said, David, it's important to make sure that when this is over, those rights are taken away from them. It was revealed a few days ago in The Guardian that Palantir have been given access to NHS data, which is a sentence I didn't think I would be saying. But yeah, so we do definitely have a challenge to keep it at the forefront of people's minds, and B, as you say, ensure that these new powers are swiftly taken away. And we know in the past, there was terrorism acts passed in the UK in the wake of 9/11 in order to allow them to detain suspects, which have never really been revoked. You can still detain suspects without a trial, and we are, it's 19 years later. So it's not necessarily going to be easy to roll back these powers that governments have been given. So I'm not as familiar with what's happened in the US in that regard. So where are you guys sitting in terms of, has there been any new powers given to the president or to the state?
Well, what's unique about the US is there's no rights to take away. There already were none. So whereas in places like the UK where you have the sort of rights being reconfigured, there's nothing to reconfigure really in the US in the same way. But also things like the Google and Apple contact tracing platform that's been recently announced as a platform. The Information Commissioner herself, Elizabeth Denham, has stated that she's reviewed it and it is compliant to the UK Data Protection Act and by, not formally, but by extension, the GDPR. And so, Europe and the UK is, figuring out how to do contact tracing within a rights-based regime, a regime that we don't have in the US. The great lesson to Americans in the Cambridge Analytica story was Europeans have basic human rights that we don't have in the US. And so that was a big motivator to rectify that, meaning have a national privacy data rights law that would catch us up to Europe in different ways. So that's really been put on hold. And so what we're looking at now is how companies that used to practice commercial surveillance covertly for other businesses, especially location tracking companies that would sell location data to marketers, have sort of repurposed their data and their tools and their platforms for the pandemic by saying, oh, look, here's our cell phone data that we normally use to sell skin cream and ski vacations. But look here, it shows who's social distancing and who's not, who's staying at home and who's not. And this is then sort of used to direct policy. And we overlook the fact that these guys have been doing this whole time. They're just feeling comfortable showing everyone now.
Yeah.
So there's like new dynamics like this that we have to confront. It is not just sort of rights being suspended, but it's also like sort of things coming out of the woodwork that have always been there. And then how will our attitudes change about them? And how are those actors using the pandemic to kind of COVID wash their practices? You know, oh, you may not have liked those targeted ads, but we helped. You know, we did our part to help people stay home. You know, like it's very easy for them to pivot their positioning because of this. So we have to be, concerned about that. So in the broad scheme of things, I hope that the Great Hack and the Cambridge Analytica scandal more broadly has given a general public a framework to think critically about these issues. So at least when we're dealing with things like the pandemic panopticon that's being built, that although things don't apply in the same way, at least we can like sort of think critically about them. So, for example, when they say it's anonymous, we can think more critically. What do they mean by that? What does anonymous mean? And is it a permanent state or is it a temporary state? Can things be de-anonymized easily or not? Who knows how to do that? How do we know how the anonymization occurs? Is there any public accountability to the way things are made anonymous, or do we just have to trust them? So when we have actors like Palantir in the mix, Clearview AI in the mix, there's a political dimension to these questions that we shouldn't overlook.
Yeah, and for our listeners who aren't aware, Palantir are a company who, for example, were involved in Chicago with predictive policing, where they were sort of looking at people's behaviour on Facebook and essentially sort of suggesting who was more likely to commit a crime based on their friendship groups, their location, ethnicity, and things like that. Not only was this happening, but the sort of mayor's office in the city were not even aware that it was going on, or certainly claimed that was the case. And this is stuff that was happening like 4 or 5 years ago. Obviously, we know that technology has advanced since then. So yeah, it's something that we have to keep an eye on. But I guess for me, it's all well and good to be aware of what is happening, but the issue I have is what can I do about it, other than having conversations with people, trying to have prominent people who understand this stuff on the podcast to talk about it, to try and educate people. What else can we do? Do we need to be putting more pressure on our elected representatives, for example? Do you think that's a route that people should be going down?
So in terms of listeners in the UK, even though certain practices have been approved for use during the pandemic, and companies have been granted an extension to the deadline that they have to respond to data requests, the data request right has not been revoked. It's just, there's just potentially, it might take longer to get your data. So for those, who have that right, it's worth exercising, because it's one of the only mechanisms we have to try and keep these entities accountable. And since we have such increased overlap between the private sector and the public sector, this is an important activity that citizens need to practice. So, asking for your NHS data or trying to find other companies to do data requests for, knowing that it may be delayed, they still have to respond eventually. And so that would be something that you could do just to keep the system honest, because if even just a small number of people request the data, it keeps these organizations knowing that they're being scrutinized. If nobody asks for data, then they're like, no, then they can say nobody cares. So
essentially, the fact that Palantir it's been revealed that Palantir have access to our NHS data in the UK kind of gives us all an opportunity in the UK to ask Palantir for our data.
Well, I'm definitely going to do that, because I don't like, if Palantir have got my data, I would at least like my data, because they're going to, all evidence points to the fact that they're going to use that in a negative fashion.
So, but something that we can maybe figure out after this is kind of coming up with an easy way for anyone who's listening to this to go through that process. Give them the link, show them where they need to go, what they need to do, how they request that, how they put in an information request to the ICO. So that's something that we'll have a look into, and we'll put up on the website and on our Twitter and stuff like that. If you're able to point us in the right direction with that, David, or put us in touch with the right people, and that would be helpful.
Sure. Yep.
So can we go back to something that you said when we were talking, that I've got a feeling Jerry was also going to go to? Brittany.
Yeah.
So when I watched it, obviously from a disclosure point of view, and I think you already know for some cases, we know Emma Bryant, and we've met Carol before, we've met Chris before. So there was a lot of people in the show that I know, if you will, right? However, Brittany, I didn't really know, and she came across very much as a marketing person, and like from when you said she kind of sold herself as a whistleblower, is there a possible suggestion there that it was a marketing opportunity for her to market herself as something that wasn't a baddie?
Or just simply to avoid any kind of scrutiny for the things that she had done while working for Cambridge Analytica, perhaps?
Yeah. So I am generally of the belief that all whistleblowers are complicated, conflicted people by the nature of where they've been, what they're trying to do, and there's no such thing as a uncomplicated whistleblower.
Yeah.
So it comes with the territory, and it's been interesting to have read both Christopher Wiley and Brittany Kaiser's memoirs, and to really try to understand them not only from their own perspectives and their own stories and their own context, but also how they exist as different expressions of the company's history. So Chris, in his memoir, represents the genesis of Cambridge Analytica, and Brittany's story represents more the peak and fall of the story. And so they were there at different times, so they have different perspectives, but they also have seen the same things from their own perspective. So when you read both of their books, you have a kind of some sort of Rashomon moments where they're two characters who have observed the same thing, but they interpret it differently, and you can kind of understand how they understand it differently. And an example of that is why Cambridge Analytica did not work for the Jeb Bush campaign.
Okay.
They both have an explanation for that in their books, and they're both plausible, and in probably some ways they're both right, because it's one of these Rashomon moments where different perspectives of the same thing kind of tell a more complete story.
Yeah, sure.
So, but there are other ways where their stories corroborate each other. And when you know that they loathe and detest each other, when you know that the reason that Christopher Wiley is not in The Great Hack, because the footage of him is all just the public footage. He didn't sit for an interview. He didn't let them follow him. They convincingly edit him in that it seems like he's there, but it's really just licensing. Yeah, they just licensed the Guardian interviews, basically.
Right.
So one of the reasons that he didn't want to be a part of the movie is because he was concerned that it was just going to be a Brittany Kaiser whitewash, that it was just going to rehabilitate her. And he has a lot of animosity to her, and she has a lot of animosity to him, and they're expressed in their books and so on. So once you sort of see this dynamic that they hate each other, but yet they also corroborate the story that a lot of people are skeptical of.
Yeah.
Is an interesting
There's no reason
dynamic
for them to do that necessarily if they don't like each other.
They're also from for those who haven't seen The Great Hack yet, they're also from very different parts of the company, but very different. I don't know how to put cognitive backgrounds. You know what I mean? Like Chris is a IT orientated person, whereas Brittany is a HR public relations orientated person more so. Do you know what I mean? Like they're like, she is less technology driven and he is more technology driven. They are from very different sides of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. He's, not really a data scientist and she's not really a lawyer, but they both claim that's their wheelhouses.
Right.
He doesn't really have the credentials of a data scientist. She doesn't really have the credentials of a lawyer, but they ostensibly perform those roles in the company. So like, for example, she wrote the first contract for the Trump campaign. But Chris Riley wrote contracts too. He wrote the contract with GSR, the company from the Cambridge University spinoff guys. So the weird way that they sort of dabbled in the law is interesting because I sort of dabbled in the law too. It was an interesting way that you could pass as various things. There's sort of a little bit of an imposter syndrome going on all around this.
Was that, so you're dabbling with the law, I take it that was as part of your kind of startup experience, your entrepreneur experience, was it?
Yes, when I started a company, I started to appreciate the law and who lawyers are and why you want one. And so when I found Ravi Nayak, my solicitor, and we were completely aligned and a real partnership where he taught me about the law and I taught him about the industry. And that was really a key to our, what made us dangerous. But back to Brittany, my opinion of her has evolved. Prior to the release of the film in January 2019, I had never met her.
Right.
But she knew of me because obviously she knew of my lawsuit.
From the inside.
From the inside.
Yeah.
And we finally met at Sundance when the film was premiered.
What a strange experience that must have been for you.
It really was.
For everyone involved, it was just a mad thing from start to finish.
It was surreal. But she was very appreciative of my work, and I started to have conversations with her because we would be on panels and I could talk to her backstage, and I would ask her questions that were always sort of nagging me, like, oh, I can ask her questions. And she was very forthcoming. She would answer my questions. And the more I sort of talked to her, the more I sort of gained some sympathy to her that she does want to try and do the right thing. She doesn't always succeed at that, but I think that she does want to be rehabilitated and then the question is, has she done enough to merit that yet? And I think participating in the film and giving them so much access was a big part of it. And then in the beginning of this year, she started releasing her hard drive. And so her hard drive is in the film. She sort of goes through her files and it seems like, wow, she's got a lot of stuff. And one thing that's not in the film that they couldn't depict but is happening during the film is she's deciding whether or not to share her hard drive with the FBI or WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks was interested in publishing her hard drive and she couldn't do both. She couldn't give it to WikiLeaks and the FBI. So she decided to give it to the FBI and then it now has released some of it in the public and she's released other parts of it to other researchers. So she's trying to make a contribution of what she can. And so for her, I think it's a process of redemption. It doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't just happen with one thing. No. But I was very skeptical of her in the beginning, and I still am. But I have learned to appreciate what contributions she has made.
Yeah. I mean, it must have been quite a satisfying experience for you to be able to go, well, actually, I want to ask her this, and to ask her and get an answer which you felt was a genuine answer.
And so illuminating, like it connected pieces and context that I hadn't dawned on me, and then all of a sudden things fell into place. So but she also withholds things strategically.
Yes.
So that was something that was obvious in her book. Like there were, you would have to be a Cambridge Analytica nerd to the extreme to appreciate the revelations in her book, which are buried but are there, and it's obvious that she saved them for her book. Like there's like, I'm not even going to tell the filmmakers about this one thing. I got to save it for the book. And Chris Wiley was the same. There were things in his book that he had to save in order to have a book worth publishing. So
had to get a book deal.
Yes. So you see those dynamics unfold, and they're just sticking out for themselves. They're looking out for themselves. You can't blame them for that. They put themselves at great risk. They're just trying to recover that cost. So, when you put it in these perspectives, you understand how they act, but you have to be aware of their motivations in order to make sense of all the material that they've put out there.
So we spoke about the kind of the legal stuff to do with the actual, or the police involvement and the legal stuff to do with the actual case. But one of the things that Chris had mentioned, one of the things that Emma had mentioned when we interviewed her, and it's been kind of suggested by Carol and the likes as well, is at times feeling unsafe in life. I mean, essentially, from all the other things that you were going through, was there any points where you thought, maybe I have bitten off more than I should have, not could have, but should have, because there is a genuine danger? I mean, Chris told an anecdote at Byline one year when he said that they were adamant that they had been getting followed for an entire night during the case. Like every time they went into a club, the same people would be there in the club, and they would leave at the same time as them and stuff. Like, did you find yourself feeling like that at any point in this process?
I was always very concerned about my cybersecurity. I would be a very attractive phishing and hacking target, because to get the privileged communication with my solicitor and my barristers at certain points, and they would have been advantageous to the other side. So we were very paranoid about that. I wonder, if I was, and I'll never know, like it's one of these things where you have to be paranoid, and you can't be too paranoid when it comes to getting hacked, and you have valuable documents. And then there was a couple of instances where Cambridge Analytica employees showed up at events that I hosted at my university. And in one particular episode, they were very intimidating, and they were. This was pretty early on. This was like December 2017, so very early on in the process. But in October 2017, I went public because I did a crowdfunder on crowd justice, and so I made my intentions clear that I was going after Cambridge Analytica. And so a couple months later, they did send the goons down to the university to intimidate me. It only sort of showed me that I was on to something, and I had to keep going. I mean, if they want me to drop the lawsuit, then they're worried about it. And so, of course, I have to proceed. So, and in retrospect, I can see why it exposed them to tremendous liabilities. So, but that was the way they worked, and they did it in a very deceptive way. They did it in a way that aligned with, how we think that they operate in using subterfuge as a professional practice.
So it was quite revealing in that sense. So can I ask how that actually manifested itself? Do you mind talking about exactly what happened, about what that encounter was like? So
I had hosted a screening at the New School that December of 2017. It was by a French filmmaker, Thomas Houchon, who released a film in French language called Unfair Game, and it was made for the English-speaking world as Trumping Democracy. And it was the first documentary to try and tackle these subjects. It was ahead of its time. But it did, try to focus a lot on Mercer in a way that The Great Hack did not. Yeah. And we had a screening of it, and there were characters in the back during the Q&A that were agitating the discussion in a way that was extremely bizarre and just completely unpredictable. For those who don't know, the New School is a very left-leaning institution in the United States, one of the most liberal left-leaning schools. And so to have an audience that was so hostile was so unexpected, and it was clear something was up. But it was a very difficult audience to manage, because you had agitators, and we were talking about the company, and they were basically, later we realized the guys in the back work there. And they're making comments about the topic, and they have not self-disclosed that they are working for the company. And so just right off the bat, you get a sense of the way that like deception just comes naturally. Like it wouldn't dawn on them to say, "Hi everyone, we work for Cambridge Analytica. We'd like to tell you our side of the story after watching this film." On the contrary, they withheld that information and tried to manipulate the audience, riling everybody up. And then afterwards, one of them, came up to me and started a conversation. We talked a lot. We talked about Brittany and many other things. And he was definitely fishing for, or not with fishing PHIs, but he was like, trying to get information from me. And it was very weird. And then in the end, when he went to leave, he gave me like a very Trump style handshake, where he pulls you in with the elbow and doesn't let go. And he was like, "Drop the lawsuit." And
So.
Right. And, it was like, all right, wow. And I was like, "You're not going to let go of my hand, are you?" But it was very, very clumsy, kind of Keystone Cops, because, they immediately revealed their game to me, and just the way that they were not a group of honest individuals. So they tried to harness the fear that you were talking about, that like we would be scared to take these guys on when they were scared of us. And the good news is that I didn't really experience harassment otherwise, so there wasn't a sort of cumulative effect.
Yeah.
I think, Carol Cadwallader had a very different experience. Chris had a very different experience. The others, endured a level of targeted, coordinated harassment that I was never victimized from. So it allowed me to just stay the course without, my worst fear was just having a big legal bill at the end of the day.
Do you think that there was an element of that was specifically because you had a court case to go through with them? Like it would have been dangerous for them potentially to harass you in the same way because it could have been used as evidence against them. You don't think that's got anything to do with it? Or?
Yeah, what they did was quite brazen, but I don't think they would go beyond what they did. That yes, there was a sort of inherent protection being having legal status, meaning the minute I was a data subject, the minute they gave me the letter that said you're a data subject of our company and we're registered with the Information Commissioner, now you have legal standing, like that already created a layer of protection that just expanded as I took more actions. So I think it's reassuring to people that like the legal system gives you some protection just by just going forward with it.
Yeah.
That helps with dealing with some of the risk.
So, what's next? What's next for you then? When we get past this this scenario that this weird surreal scenario we all find ourselves in at the moment. What's your plan to kind of take this fight forward and continue to raise awareness, continue to put pressure? What have you got lined up?
Yeah, it's been difficult to contend with how life has been disrupted, and I would have to say I I'm still managing the disruption. I'm still figuring out what this new reality is. So I don't have a clear plan. My clear plan was thrown out the window. And so I'm trying to figure it out. But I think trying to get involved in conversations about pandemic surveillance, trying to help people think critically about it, trying to advocate for solutions that I think are the least harmful. Those are things to do in the meantime, but also lead towards, if there's all this talk about, especially in the US, like reopening as if we haven't like peaked yet. But part of, returning to normality, part of reopening, part of going back to normal will actually be resuming the conversation that we left off, which was trying to get a national data rights law passed in the United States, because I think the United States poses a particular danger to the rest of the world by not having any fundamental data rights, because our system tends to be exported, and it should be exported with a human rights model underlying it, and is currently not. But there's great potential for it to be reformed. Yeah. So it's a matter of, when we go back to normal, a sign that things are returning to normal will be us coming back to the discussion of like, what's going on with all this mass data abuse and where are our data rights? Yes, things happened during the pandemic, but they happened responsibly because we did X, Y, and Z, and these things went over the line and we need to pull them back. Just like, I think that's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be really hard to pull stuff back once we've crossed those lines.
Have you ever written any articles for any publications around the theme, around data surveillance and stuff?
Yes, I have been writing in mainstream publications about my story and sort of op-eds type work that can be found on off my Twitter. I've also been working on some academic writing related to this. Academic writing takes a long time to do and then finally get published, so It's not happening as rapidly as the regular stuff. And I think there is some important writing that I'm working on, and in some ways the pandemic has changed, that writing. So it's all about adapting to this, trying to figure out a way to adapt, both in our everyday lives, but also in our critical work and our critical practice. It's all part of the same thing. So hopefully we can influence the debates, and we can encourage people to not surrender to surveillance.
Sure.
That we can understand it has a role to play in this pandemic, but also that it's going to have to be harmonized with the different cultural attitudes. So, for example, things that have been done in Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, China are tolerable in those cultures, would not be possible in Europe, would not be possible in the US.
Yeah.
So it's really about, figuring out how our own cultures and laws and norms will get through this in different ways.
I guess we'll certainly make sure that when we put the episode out, we've got some links to like your Twitter. Do you have a blog or anything like that we direct focus all the writing and stuff? People can follow you on Twitter and they'll be able to keep up to date with what you're doing.
Yeah, a good place to look for stuff that I was working on just before the pandemic is a Medium post that's on my Twitter that I just listed the stuff I did in 2019, and Great. It has lists of the writings and the activity and the legal stuff and on all of that. So it's a good jumping off point to kind of dig into more, but there's a lot more to come. And I think the contributions that I make to academic writing will trickle down in a different way. But I am trying to figure out just like everybody else.
Well, what we'll do is we'll keep you in the loop when we start looking into this process for requesting data off of Palantir, which, to be honest, is something I'm more looking forward to than I had been in a long time. But yeah, certainly when we start doing that, we'll make sure you're in the loop. And as Jerry had said, if you can point us in the right direction, anyone who is in the UK and more clued up on request of data than we are, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, Palantir is a great sort of test case to see how an American company deals with UK law when they operate on UK soil. And the other thing about Palantir is David Carroll, the CEO, when he brags about what the company's strength is they say that they have sort of the best in class privacy controls. That is, they only let people in an organization see the data that person has the authority to see, and that's sort of why their software is so great. So it's a great opportunity to test that with a subject access request, because by asking organization, who has access to my Palantir data?
Yeah, and at what level?
Under UK law, you should have right to that. Some basics around that information. So you could really sort of force Palantir to explain to the public, we protect data by doing these things. And then here's an example of it.
Yeah.
When it comes to your data, the people who saw it is part of your personal data. Like, who has seen your data is part of your personal data in terms of your Palantir file. So trying to get a Palantir file exposed
would give us a bit of insight into that. And that's the explanatory piece that you were talking about when it came to your Cambridge Analytica data as well.
That's right. Section 7 of the UK Data Protection Act is a glorious little clause that really needs to be used, and it really gives people right to an explanation. And that was really the core of our Cambridge Analytica case. And that's what they got prosecuted for. They did not provide an adequate Section 7 disclosure. The ICO said it's a criminal offense to ignore our order to disclose. And so they do take this seriously. Section 7 is something they take seriously. So that's what we have to work with. So let's work with that.
One final thing I'd like to ask you: when you saw the footage of Cambridge Analytica employees walking out with boxes and boxes of documents from their offices as they were being closed in on the news, were you as absolutely devastated inside as I was?
We always knew that it was a. We always knew that it was a moonshot to get the truth exposed, that there would be so much effort to conceal it. But we came close. I think it was a similar kind of feeling when the Information Commissioner announced that she was going to get a warrant to raid them, as opposed to just surprising them with the warrant. The world gave the company plenty of warning that we were onto them for years. So I think we got a lot out of them, a lot more than we could have, and it shows how sort of lax the company was with its own information.
Well, you should be very proud of what you achieved, man. We've definitely, we wouldn't have got as far in this kind of fight without your significant contribution. So thanks very much for that, and thanks very much for talking to us today. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me on. I'm glad that people still care and that we're still talking about it, and we're just figuring out what's next. So thanks for having me on, you guys.
No worries.
More than welcome. Thanks.